Released in 1988, Wasteland was a pioneering RPG boasting one of the first reactive, persistent worlds in gaming history. Garnering both critical and financial success, the developer Interplay set their sights on a sequel. Unfortunately, the publisher and IP owner, Electronic Arts, had already resolved to continue the franchise in-house. Almost right away, EA began work on Fountain of Dreams, a RPG set in a post-nuclear Florida billed as a Wasteland sequel, despite the fact that no one from the original dev team was involved in any way. To their credit, they did improve upon the mechanics in some ways and had an interesting story concept. But the final product was a rushed imitation of Wasteland that's mostly forgotten today. Meanwhile, Interplay still owned the engine that powered Wasteland and began looking into new game ideas. Around this time, Interplay CEO Brian Fargo wrote a list of potential ideas for future titles. Some entries are checked as they had already been made, like Cyberpunk for their 1988 title Neuromancer, but others wouldn't be made for years like Road Warrior, which likely became Fallout. Other ideas on this list would never reach fruition, like Killer Chess, seemingly a lost sequel to Battle Chess for the CDI. Another idea was time travel, for what would become the Wasteland team's next project. The game was soon titled MeanTime, and the team was made up of mostly former Wasteland veterans, including Liz Danforth, who made Hypole and the iconic Rabid Dog Quest, Marco Green, who would go on to write the majority of talking head dialogue in the first two Fallouts, Michael Stackpole, best known for his work on various Star Wars novels, and lead designer Alan Pavlish, who was Wasteland's most influential contributor. At some point in early 1988, Alan wrote a new map editing program for Wasteland's engine. Wasteland's maps were built using an archaic system, where designers would draw the levels on graph paper, then scripters and programmers coded it by typing out bytes using a Merlin assembler. This new program allowed designers to simply place icons on a map and directly edit the scripting data, allowing them to make much more complex levels than before. It's unknown exactly when development began, but MeanTime was cryptically advertised in a variety of magazines starting in June 1988. The basic premise was that a group of bad guys traveled through time and changed major events. The player would then have to travel back through time, making sure important local events occurred as they had in our timeline. Along the way, you'd meet prominent historical figures, some of which could be recruited to join your team. These companions had a mysterious fate historically, explaining how you could take them time traveling and not mess up the timeline. For example, Amelia Earhart, who famously disappeared during a flight around the world, could be found in a Japanese POW camp and recruited. One mission took place at the end of the Second World War, and saw the antagonist attempting to kidnap famed German engineer Werner von Braun. The villain's plan was to bring him to the Soviet Union, which would have set back American rocket research and affected the course of the Cold War, even causing the Soviets to land on the moon instead of the Americans. The player's team would have arrived about the same time as the bad guys, resulting in a gunfight where the player could recruit von Braun. If successful, they could drop him off into the hands of the US military, completing the mission. In another mission, you could travel back to the 17th century to meet French novelist and duelist Cyrano de Bergerac. In one scene during a bar fight, you could impress Cyrano into joining your team by swinging across a chandelier and hitting a bad guy. This Apple II mock-up of the game shows him joining the player's party. The biggest feature of this timeline was a ship-to-ship battle where characters would have run up and down the deck of a ship, loading and firing cannons. P.T. Barnum and Albert Einstein were two additional recruits, the latter of which was apparently on the game's box art, but an image of it has never been released. Another scenario saw you travel to 1930 Chicago to recruit crime lord Al Capone. The concept of famous historical characters worked well because of the skill-based system MeanTime inherited from Wasteland. Each historical figure had a super skill leveled beyond what the player could reach themselves, like von Braun being a master engineer and Cyrano having a maxed out fencing skill. Eventually, the player would use the expertise of their renowned companions to defeat the bad guys and save the day. Now, this sounds a lot like Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, which was released the same year work began on the game. However, the developers have stated they created the idea independently and were worried they'd be attacked for plagiarizing the film. By mid-1990, the maps were 75% complete and much of the coding was finished. From the outside, everything was going well. But the complexity of time travel-based reactivity had already caused the game to miss its original 1989 release date. One of the biggest issues stemmed from the non-linear structure where the player could choose from several different missions at a time. Your successes or failures would then change future missions in both minor and major ways. The sheer number of possibilities and a lack of leadership slowed production, as Liz Danforth recounted. Detailed storyline development required of any game design is difficult. I'm a reasonably logical kind of storyteller, but following out every thread of possibility. But what if they do this? Or that? Or, oh my god, wouldn't they expect to be able to do that? Can be excruciating. MeanTime had this in spades. Like all time travel stories, things became unbelievably twisted and convoluted. And we had to account for every single one of the possibilities. Everything we could imagine. And the key facts had to be historically accurate, or plausible in that time, which entailed research when Google hadn't been invented yet. We kept hitting naughty time paradoxes to untangle, even as we created more with every day's design work, and everyone already had so many other irons in the fire. Liz left the company around this time, and not long after, another, much worse problem emerged. MeanTime was made for the Apple II, which by then was nearly 20 years old and at the end of its lifespan. Game sales for the computer had drastically declined during development, leading to the game being cancelled in late 1990. At some point in 1991, Interplay attempted to resurrect the project. Bill Dugan, who had worked as a designer on Wasteland and MeanTime previously, was brought on to lead this iteration of development. He helmed a skeleton crew consisting of one contract programmer, one designer, and one artist. Their plan was to update the game for MS-DOS, finish the remaining areas, and completely upgrade the graphics from 8-bit to 16. This would cause even more issues because the map editing program was never ported. This meant that maps had to be made on an Apple II, then moved over to a PC and tested, increasing the time it took to make levels significantly. Despite that, progress continued steadily until early 1992. When the final nail was driven into MeanTime's coffin by the release of Ultima 7. Even though they had improved the graphics for the new port, it was seen as incapable of competing against the superior 3D models in Ultima. It was so ancient at this point, they would have had to practically remake the entire game for it to rival the competition. Lacking staff and resources, Bill Dugan recommended its cancellation, and MeanTime was scrapped for the second time. The game had been cryptically advertised for over a year, but would never be officially cancelled. Confusion among fans also led many to believe it was a direct sequel to Wasteland, even though the only real connection was the engine and dev team. All of this would lead to MeanTime becoming somewhat of a mythical game among Wasteland fanatics, and it would even make an appearance on Computer Gaming World's top 15 vaporware games of all time. Later in 1996, Interplay designer Chris Taylor revealed there had been multiple attempts to finish the project after its initial cancellation. He also unfortunately revealed that MeanTime's source code disk went bad, and that there are currently no known remaining builds. After Interplay was bought out by Titus, Brian Fargo founded inExile Entertainment. In 2014, they intriguingly applied for a trademark for MeanTime, hinting at their plans to bring it back from the dead once more. There was ample speculation it would be their next title after Wasteland 2, but they never finished the filing process and the trademark status is currently abandoned. It's been almost a decade since then, and there's been almost no mention of the game since, meaning that it will likely never see the light of day. Time travel RPGs were still a novel concept in the late 80s, and MeanTime was primed to be a landmark title, built off the foundations of Wasteland. But after at least 3 separate attempts, it's ironically forever lost to time, now existing only in the minds of the developers and the fans who still dream of what could have been.